Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second of our HipFest at Home presentations for 2025. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alison Strauss, and I'm the director of HipFest and the programmer of the Hippodrome year round. As ever, we're going to start off with a bit of housekeeping before we get properly underway. Subtitles are available by clicking the CC icon in the YouTube video player. And if you're joining this presentation for the online premiere, you can submit questions or comments in the chat box. And our speaker, Thomas, has kindly agreed to watch along as this talk goes live. So we'll endeavour to respond to any messages in the chat throughout the presentation. And the window in the chat will close quite quickly once the premiere has concluded. So don't save all your questions for the end. Try to drop them in as we go. Now, that is all the practicalities out of the way. I do really very much appreciate these chances to connect with our online audience at these pre-fest presentations. They do have quite an intimate feel, even though they're in the virtual realm, especially at the premieres when we watch along together and share reactions and discussion points. This latest batch of presentations has been curated to complement the 5-day festival in March, and by the time you tune into this, the contents of our 2025 programme will have been unveiled. So voila, this talk on Ben Carré is brought to you as a tasty amuse-bouche for our Friday night gala presentation of The Pride of the Clan. And I think I'm justified in using a couple of fromage-y French expressions, given that Ben was a Frenchman. We're going to be hearing about many films in Carré's career, but the one we're most excited about is our Friday night gala film, The Pride of the Clan. It's set in Scotland, after all. And the great thing is that even if you can't join us in person for the gala, it will be available online too. There's going to be an optional audio description for blind and visually impaired audiences online and in the venue. Booking to watch online closes at midnight on Saturday, the 22nd of March, and it will be available to view for 48 hours only from 12 noon on Saturday, the 23rd of March to Tuesday, the 25th of March. So I really hope you can join us one way or another. Now, it gives me very great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Thomas A. Walsh. Thomas is an Emmy Award-winning designer and filmmaker. His 51-year career spans features and TV, IMAX films, documentaries, and Broadway productions. Highlights include the New York Theatre world premiere production of Children of a Lesser God, whilst his film and TV credits include John Carpenter's Vampires and the long-running hit series Desperate Housewives. Thomas is the founder of the Art Directors Guild Archives, and his publication achievements include Designs on Film, Hollywood Art Direction, published by HarperCollins, and Art of the Hollywood Backdrop, published by Regan Arts. Now, I was lucky enough to see many of the films he programmed at last year's Pordenone Silent Film Festival for the first ever retrospective of pioneer art director Ben Carré's silent films. And it is on this topic that Thomas has kindly agreed to talk with us today. I'm especially pleased that we'll get to see one of these films in its entirety. Prepare yourself for lots of exuberant pumpkins. We're going to have piano accompaniment by the wonderfully talented musician and HipFest regular Mike Nolan. Now, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our presenter, Thomas A. Walsh.
Thank you, Alison, very much. That was very kind. As just an advisory, I'm a native Californian of Hollywood High School. English is very much my second language, and French is a distant fourth or fifth. But I will do my best, and my apologies now to the French community for mangling your beautiful language today. Today, I want to share with you my efforts to date at capturing and telling the story about Benjamin Jules Carré. Ben was one of cinema's premier art directors. And when I say premier, I mean one of the first of the few. He has been called by critics the man that painted our dreams, and it's really quite true. For me, this journey started as a journey, and it has become an odyssey. Today, we will be sharing research clips and images from a short introductory film that we created to chronicle and promote Ben's story and legacy in order that we can complete our 90-minute documentary, which is currently a production in progress. We are very grateful to Allison, Christina, and the HipFest community for this opportunity to share Ben's story. First, Ben has many firsts. First of the generation of art directors for the cinema, before they even had a name, and we'll talk about that in a minute. First to paint in color for black and white film when the labs and the cameramen were saying, oh, it has to be all in gray. Ben proved them wrong and showed it through his talent and expertise. He was the first to master designing for the camera's lens, and he was a master of perspective drawing at a time when there were no schools, there was no training. You learned on the job. He was the first to work with synchronized sound in Hollywood. And he was the first to experiment with working in color for Technicolor film production. He was also the most experienced art director to work in America, in Fort Lee, and in Hollywood, having done hundreds of films, more than he can remember and more than that we can piece together. So who am I? I'm not a scholar, but like Ben, an artisan and a tradesman. Also like Ben, I prefer the title of art director to production designer, which I'll explain further in a minute. I've always been fascinated about learning and sharing stories about the origin of my profession of art direction. The challenges, and there are many, there is no existing or coherent scholarship about the origins of art direction for the cinema or where it began. Nothing. There are only shards of information prior to the 1930s. And before 1919, the story of art direction's history is non-existent. Once our lost films are now being recovered and preserved, it makes it far easier for us to tell the story. There are only a handful of art director biographies to draw from, however, and the best first effort at reconstructing art direction's silent film origins, a 1979 Thames Television exhibition at the V&A entitled The Art of Hollywood, 50 Years of Art Direction. This was my first introduction to Ben Curé, and he was the most senior art director represented in that exhibition. So why me? Like Ben, I began my career in the theater, and I was trained as a scenic artist. I have been a long life freelancer, as well as one who has lived the trials and tribulations of working and surviving as an itinerant tradesman in the theater and cinema. I also have experience in mounting exhibitions and creating documentaries and publications about cinema's film history and its filmmakers. So how did the journey with Ben begin? What started as a research study based on my curiosity has evolved into a deep dive and obsession, if you ask my family. Because there is no scholarship, where does one begin? It was film historian and researcher Mark Wanamaker who gave me Ben's 400-page unpublished manuscript called Reminiscences of My Years as a Motion Picture Art Director. This and related writings became my Rosetta Stones. These are the first detailed accountings of the origins of art direction, not beginning in Hollywood or Fort Lee, but in Paris. Ben's story begins in 1883 and goes until his passing in 1978 at the age of 95. He outlived them all. Ben was one of very few first-generation art directors who was trained in the European traditions of designing settings for the grand opera, theater, ballet, and then the cinema at its very beginnings. Ben trained and worked in independent ateliers comprised of freelance artists. All of them were masters and specialists in every facet of design styles, genres, periods of art history, architecture, and scenic techniques. So today, it is our hope that you will enjoy today's compressed introduction, We dedicate this discussion to the many filmmakers and archivists and historians and knowledge keepers who have devoted their lives to capturing and preserving the collective memories of the pioneers of the silent cinema. Now let's take a linear route to recount Ben's career and odyssey. And you can see also the main people that were the most influential in Ben's life and career. These are the different periods of art direction. The thing about art direction is we were never given credit for our work until really the 1914 and on. Before that, it was only the director and the cinematographer. There was never one title that represented art direction. So in the French period, 1896, 1914, we have artists. They were first referred to, because this comes out of the theatrical tradition, artists, painters, and decorators. Then they were called décor, and that was the period that Henri Messnier and Robert Garnier and Ben all began their work at Gaumont Studios in Paris together in 1905, 1906. And then they were called directors artistic, chief decorator, and architect. Then we have the American period, 1900 to today. And designers were mostly uncredited still in this period from 1900 to 1911. And the titles, first titles are Scenery by, and those were, that title was claimed by Henri Messnier when he started to work for Solax Studios, Alice Guy Blachet's studio in Fort Lee. And then Ben also had that title when he came to Eclair Studios in Fort Lee in 1912. Then you have stage settings by, interior settings by, interior decorator, director, artist, decorative artist, design by, designer and artist, mechanical effects by, scenic effects by, construction manager, illustrator, artistic titan, that's a great title, master stage decorator, general stage director, technical director, electrical engineer. And then it isn't until we get to 1914 when an American designer from Broadway, Wilford Buckland, was given the title of art director for the production of The Virginian. Confused yet as to what we call ourselves? Then we get into the Hollywood studio system, which we can credit Cedric Gibbons at MGM in 1926, claiming the title of supervising art director. And then the final one is visual consultant, which was given to Ken Adam because the unions didn't want him to be called an art director or production designer in Hollywood at that time. And he got that for pennies from heaven, 1981. Now, the question is, what title is the right title? Truth is, for an art director, they're all the right title because those are all kind of facets of what they contribute to the making of a movie. Let's now take a look at Ben's childhood, clip number 1, and you'll get a better sense of how he got into this business.
Benjamin Jules Carré was born in 1883 into a working-class family living in the Belleville district of Paris. His father, Germain, was a master decorator and fine art painter who helped restore the painted interiors of the Sainte-Chapelle. He died when Ben was 6, poisoned by the lead in his paints. Ben's mother, Louise, was left managing a fruit and vegetable shop to support Ben, his sister Jeannie, his grandmother, his aunt, his cousin, Coco the poodle, Grigri the cat, and a parrot. Belleville's supportive community of artists and tradesmen helped keep the Carré family together. They also provided young Ben with his first experiences of theater, opera, and music halls. By the age of 13, Ben Carré's natural talents for art, literature, and mathematics were clear. He dropped out of his rigorous Catholic school without telling his mother and created his own elective education, which included swims in the River Seine, walks through the Tuileries Gardens, circus shows at the Cirque d'Hiver, and unauthorized explorations of the Louvre Museum. When Ben's mother Louise found out, she arranged for an apprenticeship with a man who provided painting estimates for houses and apartments. Ben quickly excelled, developing his math and spatial drawing skills with special access into many beautiful Parisian interiors. Paris in 1900 felt like the center of the creative universe. Art, design, architecture, literature, and science flourished, and 17-year-old Ben was right in the middle of it. A family friend, chief electrician at the Théâtre La Gaîté, introduced Ben to the head of one of Paris's premier scenic painting studios, Monsieur Aimable. The studio designed the kinds of elaborate backdrops and settings for theater, opera, and dance that Ben had seen as a child in Belleville. And it was at Atelier Aimable that he found his calling, as an unpaid scenic apprentice on a 4-year contract. At last, he told his mother, I got my wish. I'm with artists who paint all day long and love their work. Ben had joined the ranks of an eclectic group of artists. They whistled in the mornings, took proper French lunches at local bistros, and sang throughout their workday popular songs from operas, music halls, and even outbursts of La Marseillaise. They were also the leading masters of drawing and painting for opera, theater, and ballet. Recognizing something special in Ben, these artists became his mentors. They insisted he study art, architecture, and literature in the library after work. They encouraged him to take one of the studio's art boxes, filled with brushes, paints, and tools, out into Paris, to art classes and to the streets, to paint what he saw. Working with the artists of the Atelier Aimable ignited Ben's joy in art. 2 fellow scenic apprentices became his lifelong friends, future pioneering art directors Henri Ménessier and Robert Garnier.
Well, that's a taste of Ben's journey from child to coming to into the studios. What I have behind me is essentially a collage of the traditions that shaped Ben's talent and career. I mean, he was working a lot at the Aimable Studios. They provided a lot of designs and paintings for the opera at the Paris Opera, and you can see the range of styles and level of skills those designers had to provide to their clients. And again, it was an independent studio, and there were a number of them. There were 6 or 7 really remarkable studios. In the French tradition too, the tradition was to paint on the floor. That's a European tradition. The canvases would be spread out on the floor, and they would be painted looking down on them. And it wasn't until they came to America where the tradition of painting on elevated frames was the pattern of, which is actually much better for cinema, for actually designing getting the perspective correctly. But you can see through this, there's pictures of the theater, and then examples of the maquettes and watercolors that they would have to create. And in this time, the set designer was really the scenic artist. They were the ones designing the scenery for the client. There would be exceptions, of course, as there always were. But in general, this is where Ben got his training, pictorial training as well. And they were also adamant about going to class in studio in the libraries and after hours. Ben was with a class of assistants who had to do everything from stretching the canvas to priming it to aiding the masters in the cartoons and the laying in of the color. And it was all with natural pigments and binders at that time. And some of the paint was quite toxic because of the types of minerals or things like lead white. So anyway, but this gives you a sense of that world. So let's go from this. We'll call up now clip 2, which is Ben's introduction to working in the cinema.
Ben also encountered a woman who would change the direction of his life. 18-year-old Alice Guy was then secretary to Léon Gaumont, the director of one of the world's very first film companies. Within a few years of working at Léon Gaumont's studio at Cité Hergé near the Bouches-Chaumont, Alice Guy became the first woman to ever write, direct, and produce a film in France. A few years later, she became the first in America. By 1896, Georges Méliès was rapidly expanding the possibilities of these new narrative films. His stories had lavish, fully realized cinematic worlds, and those worlds needed designers. The first art directors were scenic artists and decorators hired from the theater. They took on the work of engineering, painting, decorating, prop making, and creating the special effects for all their studio's projects, filmed on location or within simple sets built on the first stages. Because controlled electric lighting wasn't yet perfected, early films depended on natural light. The first film stages were glass structures modeled after greenhouses. The interiors were outfitted with the kinds of wooden platforms, mechanical equipment, and rigging that were commonly used on theatrical stages.
That was good. That was good. Yes. Yes.
The cinema's industrialization began in Paris. A lot of people, certainly in Hollywood, are amazed to know that there was a world before Hollywood, or maybe New York and Fort Lee. But in truth, for all intents and purposes, the industrialization of cinema begins in Paris in 1900. And essentially the three leading studios at that first point in time was Georges Méliès' studio, and then Pathé, and then Gaumont. And Ben obviously began his career at Gaumont. Henri Messonnier, though, actually began as a freelancer moving around the town. So he worked at Méliès' studio first, and he did some time at Pathé, as did Robert Garnier. But you can see what those studios, these are all the prototypes for making film on a regular, systematic way. And they were all learning as they go. There was no roadmap to follow. All these people, all these entrepreneurs were true pioneers at creating cinema in a succession, often within a day or a half a day, depending on. And they had no scripts. They were making it up as they go. They weren't even really drawing from literature yet too much. As it evolved very quickly, they started to adapt books and short stories and purchase stories. But anyway, the pictures across the top are of Méliès' first glass studio. And there was an illustration there by Méliès from the voyage or trip to the moon. But it is also kind of represents the energy of working in the studio space. And then there's one picture below on the right is a picture of Méliès and a few other scenic painters working in his paint studio. And then on Pathé was really noted for their documentaries and travel films, but they also had a very robust narrative group as well. And there's a lovely watercolor in the middle there, which was done by Robert Garnier, of the Pathé studio, of just a typical day at the workplace, which is fantastic. And then Gaumont really had the most of a factory situation because they were manufacturing cameras and film as well. So it was one of the first truly integrated, vertically integrated studios where from soup to nuts, everything was made there and it was produced there and distributed from there, edited there and distributed from there. And they had two stages side by side. You can see in the middle, there was one, and it's sort of a throwback. One of their stages was more like an actual theater stage with traps. And the other was more of the glass house. They were all glass because they were using the natural daylight to light. And they used a Belgian frosted glass. So now let's take a look at clip number 3. This is a joy because it was, as we have mentioned, Ben his first real aha film was the making of The Pumpkin Chase. And it was the one where he realized what the art director's role was primarily that of solving problems and working with everyone all at once to make it happen. So let's take a look at that clip. Okay. Well, there you go. That's, that film probably took a few days to make. Um, there is a little bit of confusion as to who was the actual director of The Pumpkin Chase. In Ben's memoirs, he really attributes it mostly to Emile Cole and Romeo Bossetti. By the truth is, everyone probably had a hand in it. I mean, at this time, Messnier and Ben and Gagne were all working together as a team, it was a tag team, working on the many films they were doing there. They were really the three prime directors or decor artists working for the studio and doing a lot of films, many more than we'll ever know. But Louise Fluade was the second to Alice Guy as director of the film production. And Etienne was also there for a while before he went on to Pathé and then Eclair in America. But I think probably the most, Bossetti had a wonderful theatrical knowledge and comedy background. So, and Emile Cole being really one of the first true animators for cinema, is the one who I would say was probably directing the Pumpkins, because they were inanimate objects that had to be brought to life and staged in reaction in relationship to the actors. So, and then there are a few pictures below here. The middle row, you see, that is kind of what the neighborhood around Gaumont was like in that period, and it's captured very well in the film. And then, a camera or a couple of cameras probably on sticks on the street. And then we have in the middle a picture of the Pumpkins before they are released. And then there's a lovely picture. This is actually of Pathé, but it represents the enthusiasm and energy of doing kind of effects and comedy work on the stage. And of course, in the lower row, we have pictures of our Pumpkins doing their thing. And then the wonderful thing about these studios is they were much like a repertory theater. They generated a lot of scenery, which they continually reused for other films and are repurposed in one way or the other. So like this little dining room in a house, I think I've seen in a dozen or more Gaumont films of different periods, maybe with a different paint. And it's the French technique of wallpaper. They didn't put up wallpaper, they painted it. So this is very much the 19th century scenic tradition. And then that rooftop, I mean, that is very much a Ben Curé kind of backdrop. So I feel very comfortable saying he painted that. And the truth is, the designers had to paint, were the lead painters on all of their shows. They were able to bring in additional painters and they worked with a team, but they really had to be the lead ones. So there is a bit of a signature in the style of that work that we've been able to capture and identify going throughout Ben's career when he was really active in designing and painting his shows. But there again, we have the pumpkin popping out of the chimney and running off to yet another scene. So with that, we'll talk about coming to America and Fort Lee.
By 1910, Paris was the filmmaking capital, but its dominance was being challenged across the Atlantic. Fort Lee, a sleepy vacation town in New Jersey, was quickly becoming the go-to backlot for Manhattan's first film companies. In 1912, when Ben was 29, he was invited to Fort Lee by director Etienne Arnaud, the new head of Eclair Films' American studio. Ben thought this new adventure might only last a few years, and he could return to France a much wealthier man. He was greeted at the New York City docks by his close friends from Paris, camera pioneers Lucien Antriot and Georges Benoit. They took Ben on a grand tour of the city, his first glimpse of the American metropolis. Together with Henri Ménessier and Joan van der Broek, the 5 men became inseparable, part of the growing French bachelor clan and community at Fort Lee. At Fort Lee, Ben worked with many directors. In the average month, they would be simultaneously designing, painting, and supervising a full slate of film projects. Drawing from their early experiences in Paris, Ben and his friends brought a new and sophisticated French approach to American filmmaking. Ben quickly developed his own personal style of effective art direction. Knowing the importance of lighting and composition, he collaborated closely with his cameramen on every project. And he introduced his modified color palette technique to American filmmakers.
Ben was invited by Antillon to come to the US, which was hard for Ben. He was always curious about America. In fact, he was invited earlier in his career to come to San Francisco and work for a scenic shop that provided for the opera in San Francisco. Unfortunately, shortly after he got the invitation, they had the earthquake, the great earthquake in San Francisco. So his invitation was rescinded, probably best for him. So he stayed on and practiced and grew at Gaumont. So in 1912, took the boat over in October of that year and arrived in New York and was greeted by Lucien, Georges, and Ben. You can see there on the town, 3 guys on the town in the city of New York, very different from Paris. And the film industry originated there in New York proper, but they didn't have the real estate. Real estate even then was very valuable and hard to claim for film production. And there was an area just across the Hudson River, a small town, which we talked about in the clip, which was you arrived at on a ferry, which went across from upper Manhattan. And that's the ferry that Ben would have taken every day to work. They all lived in the city and traveled to work every day. But you can see from that photo of Lucien on the right, one of the cameramen working for Leclerc, Fort Lee was pretty quiet and lonely. And it's a lovely photograph, which he actually shot. And then the next row, you can see the first company, 1911 to 1914 at Leclerc Studios. It was pretty humble compared to the industrial world of Paris that Ben came from. And the stages were small, or one stage, and with a backlot area, you can see in the middle there. And then there's Etienne and Ben on that stage doing one of the early films. It was pretty depressing for Ben, because though he was able to find good craftsmen, he was alone, and he was not an English speaker, so he was having to learn English on the job. They did have some interpreters, but there was a lot of sign language at first. But you can see in the bottom there's again Georges and Ben and Lucien at the Eclair studio. Now, the thing that's important to know about Eclair is it was really the bridgehead for what we refer to as the French clan. And there were the one thing that Eclair was very good at was its training of its technicians, both in lab work and in cinematography in Paris. So they really, and they were the first to open up an auxiliary studio in America, in Fort Lee. So it was Eclair that really funneled a lot of the major accomplished, experienced technical talent to the American film industry at this time and at this place. And that French clan, of course, became a very tight community of expats working together in this new crazy world of American film production. So we'll talk about Ben's working relationship with director Maurice Tourneur.
It was at Éclair Films, and soon after Paragon World Studios, that Ben Cret began his long collaboration with French director Maurice Tourneur. Over the next 5 years, Ben designed 32 feature-length films for Tourneur, influencing the visual that Tourneur became known for. This new style emerged in their 1915 film, Trilby. Set in the Latin Quarter of Paris, Trilby's story of struggling artists was set in a world that Ben had experienced. His set designs drew from the artist studios and shared community of his bohemian friends. Ben Cret and Maurice Tourneur had a mutual understanding. Tourneur focused on the story and the actors. The cameramen managed the photography and lighting, and Ben managed the sets with all their details. The trademark Tourneur style, with significant contributions by Ben, is clear in their 1917 film, A Poor Little Rich Girl. Their 1918 film, The Bluebird, set a new standard when it was released. Their on-set creative problem-solving had introduced cinematic solutions never before imagined or attempted.
So the first 2 years at Éclair was him working with multiple directors. He was always working with multiple directors until in 1914, Etienne went back to France to participate in the war. And Maurice Tourneur was hired to become the new director of Éclair Studios. And it was there that a very unique relationship was cemented between Maurice Tourneur, who was really the first true director, writer, and producer working in Fort Lee. I mean, there were Americans as well, but he was the most experienced and accomplished of his generation coming into the film industry in America. And at the same time, at the studio, Ben was introduced to John Van den Broek, he was Dutch, but or Belgium, I'm not sure. Unfortunately, there's very little background information on John Van den Broek, and if there's anybody out there that knows more about his origins, I'll take it. And then, of course, Ben in his worker overalls. And someone that we should mention, because it's so important, you can have the creative furies here, what I call the creative triangle of the director, cameraman, and art director. But we all need Medicis, we need financiers. And the entrepreneur of all entrepreneurs, again, nothing has of consequence been written about him, and it must be, was Jules Roulator. He was a French Canadian from Louisiana, and an amazing fellow. He was first came to New York to sell photographic papers, and then ultimately became the main license agent for Eastman Kodak in terms of the sale of their films to the film industry. And he was an amazing inventor. He was one of the first people to partner with Éclair and being French as well, or a French speaker, to really ignite the Éclair studio in Fort Lee. But then he would invest in all the other studio startups in Fort Lee. So he had a hand in every pot. But he in particular was the main financial force behind Maurice Tourneur. along the top, and then along the middle, you see everything was done in those studios. They had their own labs. They did all the editorial. That's the editing area in the left. And it was during this time that Ben was primarily working for Turnout. And they did those 34 films together. It was an extraordinary body of work to do in a 4.5, 5 year period. And then they had their own back lots. And interesting enough, because Ben wrote very, very little about his personal life. He was very guarded about that. And that's where we've had to put together more information. And since we began, we've finally found Ben's granddaughter, who's been very helpful with photos of the French period. Her mother, Janine, there, you can see in the far right, or her grandmother, I should say, and Ben, and young Evelyn, their daughter. But working with Turner and the cameraman, they really created a very strong bond of confidence. That's what every designer, art director hopes for, is to be able to have repetition in your employment so that you can speak in short sentences and you are trusted and permitted and encouraged to do what you do best. And they were so confident in each other, and it shows in the work that those films really shine amongst many of their competitors at that time. And then towards the, actually, it's sort of the middle, in 1917, they took an adventure, an outing together. Mary Pickford was engaged to do work because she was working for the famous players Lasky, or she had a contract with them. And her first film with Turner was The Pride of the Klan. And Turner was very comfortable working on his stages and doing what location work he needed to, but it was always in proximity to the Fort Lee studio. Pride of the Klan is a great departure because it's the first film that was actually shot almost completely on location, on a distant location. I'm not talking about, half a day travel, but in this case, Marblehead, Massachusetts. You can see there's the touring car, and the roads weren't very good up and down the East Coast at that time. So if you can imagine these gentlemen in their overcoats driving madly up and down the coast of New England, trying to find the perfect location for their Scottish fishing village. And they went as far as Portland, Maine. And then coming back, they came back through Boston again and followed the coast. And then were suggested by a theater owner in Boston that they should go look at Marblehead. And they did. And immediately, both Turner and Ben saw the possibilities of building this fishing village on the rocky front, looking over the Atlantic Ocean. And the picture in the middle is the result of the village that Ben built. And Ben talked about in his memoirs being very proud of this particular photograph because it's him with John Vanderbroek and their crew, which mostly came from the studio in Fort Lee, which again was not something that happened. They brought up all their leads. They probably put them on trains and brought up all their equipment and building equipment. And they hired locals as well. And they built a complete village and hired a boat and beached it for the boat scenes. And then they did a little work back at the studio. On the lower right is a picture of Vanderbroek and Maurice filming Pickford and Moore in the recreation of the interior of the boat on the stage, where they did some of their effects work with the singing in the water and everything. The wonderful thing about, again, The Pride of the Klan, as you'll see it, is it has a documentary feeling about it. It does not feel artificial. It feels rich in its contrasts and colors, and its sort of authentic naturalism. It is not affected. It feels like it's a real moment in time with people having an experience, and it takes cinema to another level that it was only starting to explore by that time. So I could ramble on for hours, but we don't have that. So let's move on, and Ben's moving to Hollywood.
World War I profoundly disrupted the French film industry. Funding, resources, and manufacturing were all diverted to the war effort, leaving New York and Hollywood to overtake Paris as the new global centers for film production. In 1919, while working for famous players Lasky, Maurice Tourneur agreed to relocate his company to Samuel Goldwyn's new studio in California. Ben, now 36, took what he described as a lonely 5-day journey from New York to Los Angeles. Dropping his bags and family at the hotel, Ben took several streetcars to reach the Ivy Street stop in a small, dusty village called Culver City. A land developer's gamble, this new studio had been built in a barley field, surrounded by farmland and oil wells extending to the horizon. Although he was initially disappointed, Ben had once again arrived at the center of filmmaking's next significant chapter. Ben's first film project in Culver City was also his last collaboration with Maurice Tourneur. Their working relationship had been in a state of decline, and the making of The Lifeline became the final breaking point, ending their long and successful collaboration. Ben recalled dressing a set. Returning in the morning, Ben was surprised to find that his set had been redressed by the assistant director, with Tourneur's instruction and approval. Ben took the interference personally, a sign of unprofessionalism and disrespect. He resigned on the spot. Before he walked off the stage, Maurice got Ben's promise that he would finish the project. Early Hollywood was a small company town where news and gossip traveled fast. Its social events revolved around evenings at Hollywood restaurants and weekly boxing matches at the old American Legion Hall. According to Ben, you could find anyone you were looking for there. Poaching crew members from rival film companies was a common practice, and there were spies everywhere. Maurice Tourneur had received a less than warm reception from his West Coast director colleagues, leaving him defensive and insecure. Mary Pickford, one of early film's reigning stars, and the first actress to sign a $1 million contract, had worked with Tourneur on 2 projects. She felt that he simply didn't understand American comedy. She doubted whether he had any sense of humor, either French or American. Instead, Mary described, his thoughts were always for the artistic and the beautiful. News of Ben's availability sped through Hollywood. He immediately received a call with a job offer from director Marshall Mickey Nealon. As Ben would later say, Tourneur was being watched.
So when Ben came to Hollywood, it was still pretty agricultural, at the least. In fact, you can see in this beautiful picture that Ben painted, a plein air picture called Moonrise over Hollywood. This is really looking across the Hollywood Hills towards anyone who knows Hollywood, Griffith Park, and it's all pasture. It's savanna. It's not what it became in weeks and months in a few years. It was really a lovely place, but of course, limited facilities for filmmaking. And then there's actually a picture of a car in front of the Lasky Players' first offices in Hollywood. And then the middle right is Universal Studios at that time. Again, a lot of real estate and people camping out, making films where there was daylight almost year-round. And then Hollywood Boulevard. And a picture, that's the Hollywood Hotel on the lower left. And on the lower right, that's a traffic jam of trucks and trucks off to the horizon, bringing lumber to build Hollywood and Los Angeles during this time. It was an amazing boomtown time to be there. So let's go into our next clip about the rise of the studio system.
film was no longer a novelty. Its growing audience had an insatiable appetite. Movies were becoming a commodity, and their creation and industry dominated by East Coast banks and corporations. The 1920s saw Hollywood's cottages, farms, and barns quickly transform into self-contained studio campuses, city-states, where creatives worked under exclusive contracts. This transition limited job opportunities for freelance artists and designers like Ben Corre. Many of the films that Ben made between 1920 and 1930 are lost to us now due to time or neglect. The films that have been preserved show us glimpses of Ben's creative journey and mastery of the art of design for motion pictures through a period of unprecedented change.
There you go. So the new beginnings, life after Turner. There were some traumatic experiences at this point in time. I mean, the upper pictures above, streetcars stop at Culver City, where Ben would take his car from downtown Los Angeles every day, his streetcar, and get off at what was the Inn Studio and had been purchased or leased by Goldwyn to be his new studio in California. So the famous player Lasky's were actually renting space at the Goldwyn Studios to do their productions. At this point in time, there were 4 glass stages. Now, this is pretty exciting for Ben because it was really the first really purpose-built infrastructure on a larger scale for making movies in. This was also the first time that Ben, who was used to doing all of his own drawings and all of his own decorating, was being introduced to what was to become the department system, where there were draftsmen working in a dedicated space just to do the drawings for the films. But it was a traumatic time for Ben because, as I say, they did several films there together, and then they had a falling out, Maurice and Ben. And part of it, Ben attributes in his writing to an unfortunate accident when they were making The Women, a film in Fort Lee. And for one, it's basically an anthology of 4 different stories. And in one of them was the story of the mermaid and the fisherman. And for that story, John Vanderbroek and Maurice went back to Marblehead again to film it. And the story goes that John was down on the rocks trying to film some setup for shots of a very stormy sea. And Maurice was there, and a huge wave overtook John and took him out to sea, and they never found his body. It was a real tragedy that really affected the morale in the company and really undermined Maurice's confidence in his own self, because he had grown so much to depend on John for his amazing camera work. In fact, there are a number of people who say if he would have lived on, his career would have outshined most of all the early cinematographers or cameramen. They didn't call themselves cinematographers, and they called themselves cameramen, and they were proud of it. He would have been one of the best. We'll never know. And as I say, he died so young. He was in his 20s, early 20s. So we'll never know. I've never been able to find more information about his origins. Going from that and working with other cinematographers, Maurice was less confident in his own judgment because he lost that deep core of confidence that he had developed over the 5 years working with Ben and John. It's terribly sad because it really was a stupid argument. Ben had dressed a set, and a new AD that they had hired to work for Turner kind of got between them and suggested that the set that Ben had just dressed for tomorrow's shooting could have been done better. And Maurice, for whatever reason, just deferred to the AD to redress Ben's set. Ben came to the stage the next day and was just pretty angry enough to quit. He was now out on the street looking for work. As it turned out, the real estate and creative real estate in terms of the movers and shakers in Fort Lee was very, very small, and everybody knew everybody. else making cinema. And a lot of them had migrated west to Hollywood. Amongst those was Marshall Mickey Nealon, who had worked with Ben back at Fort Lee and had encouraged Ben, or actually said to Ben, if you ever leave Turner, you must call me. You have to make that promise. That followed about 3 years of infrequent work. Ben left this lovely studio in Culver City to go into what those of us who came up through independent filmmaking remembered, where you got the money, but then you had to create your entire infrastructure in order to make the film, whether it was renting a warehouse or an old supermarket or whatever to make your movie in. In this period of time, there were a lot of startup companies working out of bungalows in Hollywood, not unlike the house there in the middle. And then they would take the backyards and put open air stages, decks with diffusing cotton sheets up above to make their films in. People of experience and talent. And when Ben came to Hollywood, he was the most experienced art director to ever work there. So while working for Nealon, he then was loaned out to Nasimova to make 2 films, actually. And then the picture to the far right there is a picture of the Lasky Ranch, which was near Universal in Burbank. And then he was loaned out again to the Garson Studios to make a film called The Soul of Raphael in 1920. So the early 1920s, Ben was bouncing around a lot, working with different director-producers, but not having enough time to build the same confidence in relationships that he had worked so hard to acquire with Maurice. Ben went into a freelancer's life in Hollywood in the 1920s. I mean, after his rocky start leaving Turner, his family had joined him, and it was a lovely time in the beginning because it was all new. And then friends from Fort Lee came out, like Rose and Emile Chatard, who were good friends. And he was actually, Chatard was, and I know I've mispronounced his name, was Maurice's mentor, and who's really got him the job at Eclair. So in this early period, we have the films Phantom of the Opera and Lights of Old New York, and Don Juan, King of Kings, in Old San Francisco, and The Jazz Singer. Let's take a look at clip 9.
Lights of Old Broadway was a Cosmopolitan production released by MGM in 1925. Set in New York City in the 1880s, Marion Davies plays a poor Irish girl living with her family in a Central Park shanty town. It was filmed entirely on MGM's Hollywood stages and backlot. Forever resourceful, Ben transformed the studio's leper colony set from Ben-Hur into the Irish shanty town. The Phantom of the Opera was a 1925 Universal production, starring character actor Lon Chaney as the Phantom. Director Rupert Julian struggled with adapting Gaston Leroux's novel into a screenplay. As a young scenic artist, Ben worked at the real Paris Opera Garnier, and he knew the theater very well. Although scheduling conflicts kept him from designing the film, he was brought on as a consultant. The 1926 film Don Juan starred John Barrymore as the legendary Spanish libertine and was directed by one of Ben's good friends from Fort Lee, Alan Crosland. It was the first Hollywood film to use a pre-recorded synchronized music soundtrack. A romantic adventure set in 16th century Rome, Ben drew on his knowledge of classical architecture and ornamentation for the film's lavish decor. With only 6 weeks to prepare, Ben felt it would have been impossible to complete without his prior knowledge. He dramatically expanded the film's many sets through expertly painted in-camera backdrops, relying on his talent for perspective drawing.
All right. So now we're into the middle of the 20s, and Ben continues to get big projects and very lucrative projects. Interesting enough, he ends up back at MGM again in 1925. He could never quite get away from MGM. He kept going there because, again, they had the best facilities and they had the best financing. And he liked being able to do the work that he wanted to do the way he wanted to do it. So it was in 1925 that he was doing La Boheme at MGM. And interesting enough, is Ben's fashion, he had done all the illustrations, all the research. He had gone through their backlots and their stock facilities and figured out how to make the movie and generated all the original work. But in the before they started production or filming, he was invited by his old friend Alan Crosland to come over to Fox and do Don Juan with John Barrymore. This was a very exciting thing for him because it was very period and theatrical. And so he turned over the making to his assistant at MGM and went on to Fox. Don Juan was a remarkable film to watch because there's a lot of theatrical tricks and visual effects, mats and stuff that Ben was very integral in the creating of. And also visual effects. That was another prerogative of Ben's. He knew how to do matte paintings as well, but of course he would like to work with other people because you had so much on your plate. The irony, of course, towards the end of this period, 1927, is that little film called The Jazz Singer, which Ben thought was useless, a silly thing. Why are we bothering doing this synchronized sound thing? Of course, it ended the career of so many and it changed cinema forever. So let's take a look at clip number 10, which will explain, with the help of Kevin Brownlow, Ben's language skills and his making of this film.
I don't think he answered the phone because he really was difficult to understand. His wife, Anne, who had a beautiful voice, was the one who arranged the visit, and I took a tape recorder, and if you want to know what he sounded like, I've got plenty of evidence. It's the usual stage French. Most Frenchmen have a slight accent when they talk like this. Sometimes a word you miss, but most of the time it's fine. But not with Ben Carré. Ben Carré was, the charmant,
Yeah, I was the first art director on that picture. That was the first picture was made. That was the sound. Well, I moved on that without. I was working at the Vitagraph studio with. I was assigned to the picture of John Barrymore, and they called me. That was at the old Vitagraph studio. None of the studio was on Sunset Boulevard. So they call me and say, you have to come over. You're going to have a picture to work on.
I'll give you the tape so that you can have it from the horse's mouth.
After The Jazz Singer, there was this period of time which is called the twilight period of cinema, of silent cinema, in which the studios were doing their retooling for sound pictures. In the meantime, they gave the filmmakers carte blanche almost to make the films that they'd want to make with the least amount of restrictions. So some pretty remarkable films come out of this twilight period in Hollywood. And for Ben, that would have been The Red Dance, which is a kind of amazing tour de force about the Russian Revolution. Shot all in Los Angeles, except for the snow sequences were shot in Truckee near Lake Tahoe in Northern California. But again, some remarkable work. And then this is also the beginning of transitions, I call transitions and the Depression, because it was this period of time that Ben's family life came apart, and he had his divorce from his wife. And Ben was always a freelancer. He was never part of his studio system. He always liked being independent and doing films the way he wanted to make them creatively, which made it hard because the studios were assigning all of their crews directly to the producers and the directors that were doing them for them. So he was kind of the outsider looking for work. And and he's getting later on in his late 30s, early 40s. And so he was doing things like offering serials like the Black Camel, Charlie Chan series. But it wasn't the level of work that he was used to doing. Fortunately for him, and this is where the phone comes in, we all live by that phone call that comes at the last, when we least expect it. And in this case, it was 20th Century Fox, where he had a history of doing very good work for. And the head of the scenic Fox visual effects department called him up, invited him back to work in their department as a scenic artist and also as a matte painter and a visual effects contributor. And it was at that time that Ben made a transition, and at midlife, he met his second and last wife, Anne Pogash Curet. And so let's take a look at this period. And we're going to show you two films, clips. One is a film that he was the visual effects designer and director of, which is Dante's Inferno in 1935. And then another phone call that he got from MGM to come back, from Cedric Gibbons this time, to do A Night at the Opera. So let's take a look.
sing an opera.
Have to sing an opera? You have to sing an opera. I'm nothing but a glorified chorusman. Let's go.
I know, the greatest tenor in the world. That's what I'm after. Why, I'm his manager.
Along with the sky of Lomond.
Hey, don't worry. The manager, he's a fix everything.
So as you can see with Dante's Inferno, a lot of creative work. I mean, this is kind of design work nobody else was doing at that time, and that what was really a 8-minute, 10-minute sequence is kind of quite remarkable. It stands alone, and then, as I say, Cedric Gibbons called and invited Ben back to do A Night at the Opera, which was inspired by idea by Cedric, because Ben knew better than anyone else, knew how to work in the live theater and capture it for film. And a lot of his gags and can be attributed directly to one of the comedy writers on the film, which was gag comedy writers, which was Buster Keaton. So they all worked together in particular to figure out how to end the movie. No one could figure out how to end the movie. And it was Ben who raised his voice in a meeting saying, well, you can do this and that in the theater, and you can swing from the ropes, and you can fall down drops like a pirate. And it was to Ben's credit that film has that sort of wonderful, mazy, zany ending. But there are set techniques in this that he had done before. Now, after that film, the next big film that MGM was going to do was Marie Antoinette, and Ben was sure he would get that project because that was his being, that was his history. Unfortunately for him, Cedric kept that film for himself. So Ben, frustrated, took on the role of again working with the visual effects department and the paint department. So you can see in that picture with Marie and the two courtiers, there's a picture of one of the backdrops he would have painted of Versailles. And then the miniature on the local right, it's a composite picture of in action or in camera live action, and some miniature work, and then a painted backing, which could have been Ben for sure. So let's move on. It was after Marie Antoinette that MGM decided to create a new scenic department from scratch, a purpose-built building for painting backdrops. And for this, they hired one of Scotland's sons, he and his brother had come to America a few years prior and were bouncing around. First, they were from the theater, trained in the theater tradition. And they were first working in New York and Chicago, and then they came to California. And it was in California that George Gibson was hired to be the head of this new scenic department. And Ben was hired also by MGM, Cedric Gibbons, to be the lead scenic painter. At this point in time, Ben had become very frustrated. He was midlife. He was not being offered the films that he wanted to do. And he was burned out as an art director. Well, he'd been doing it for a long time. And this was an opportunity to him to go back and do what he loved doing the most, which was painting. And Ben was the most experienced painter at that point in time, painting for the cinema, because he knew how to paint for the lens. So across the top there, you see George, and you see the paint deck of the scenic shop. And then we have a picture of Ben with his charcoal and stick laying out what was the architecture for the Notre Dame on the far right. And through this period of time, which was 1937 to 1965, Ben performed as the lead scenic painter for MGM. And so there is hardly a film, especially one that was of consequence, that Ben wasn't the first person to lay out the drawing and lead in the painting. From The Wizard of Oz, when the studio had to transition back to painting with color, and laying out those hills and mountains, to National Velvet, to any number of historic films. The two films in particular I'll point out that he did during this long period of time was American in Paris, because Ben was the lead painter on that set for that ballet, and then laying out the backdrops for the North by Northwest, Mount Rushmore.
American in Paris. We were doing sets that represented the Impressionist painter. I think that we were contributing a tremendous amount to motion picture. I think we had one by Dufy, he's post-impressionist really, one by Van Gogh, one by Lautrec, one by Renoir, one by Rousseau. We had all these different sets which had to be done in the manner of the painter to make them look like one big painting, if you recall the ballet sequence. I remember we were doing the Dufy background, which was a big backing. It was over 100 feet long. The stage floor had been overlaid with asphalt, with a thin layer of asphalt, which we used to do frequently, and it ramped up to the backing, you know. And of course it was painted a color consistent with what we had on the backing. And I remember I started carrying the painting down onto the floor when Manelli walked in with Preston Ames. I can't believe it. This is wonderful. You know, the painting of the carrying the whole so that it appeared to be a vertical painting.
So in 1965, Ben retired, and he became pretty much forgotten. He continued to do his own painting. He was never ever without his drawing book or his brush, but it was in this period of time that people like Kevin Brownlow and William Everson reached out to Ben and became his friend, and captured his stories, and encouraged him to write them down. And also, most importantly for Ben, he was searched out by students of film as silent films were being rediscovered. And his work, especially in Pumpkins, he was so surprised that people were even interested in Pumpkins. He barely remembered it. And it became a cult classic of its own. But it was at this period of time that Kevin and William was able to get the Telluride Film Festival to invite Ben back to come and relive his experience. And they showed the Bluebird, and they awarded him their silver medallion for his body of work. And as Ben would say, it's better to be remembered than forgotten. And he passed a year later, but with knowing that his long career was not for naught, and that he was actually appreciated at the end for his long body of efforts and accomplishments. And with that, I leave you with great gratitude, and may you enjoy the Pride of the Clan and seek out Ben's other work.
Thank you, Thomas Walsh, and thank you, Mike Nolan, for your music. It was really wonderful to share that, for you to share with us that odyssey of Ben Carré's story, and make sure that he is not forgotten. We often at the festival shine a light on uncredited and unrecognised women in the silent era, and now, thanks to you, we can proudly play a small part in bringing out of the shadows the creative people responsible for art direction. And there were just so many great images that you generously shared with us and clips. And it really did give us a real insight into the realm of art direction. And it really, it all just goes to show that there's so many avenues of research in this period still to explore. And so best of luck to you with the documentary. I know I speak for everyone here when I say how much we're looking forward to that project being realized. So good luck with that. And it was really exciting, especially I want to say thank you for sharing those behind the scenes shots of the filming of Pride of the Clan, even with that sad association with Marblehead of the tragic death of John Vanderbrook. But we do it. Yeah, thank you for that. And also for your mention of George Gibson, the Scottish artist. And it reminded me of something I should have mentioned before, which is we've got a talk on at the Hippodrome on the 12th of March at 11 in the morning, which is, it's not about the silent era, but it is about the lost art of Hollywood. And it's about exactly what you've been talking about with an art lecturer, Gary Fry. So check that out.
Gary, yeah.
Yeah.
Get some of our backdrops.
Yeah, exactly. The donated backdrops are going to be looked at in detail. So that's fantastic. Thank you for that. Thanks to everyone, all of you at home, for joining us. This conversation will remain on the Falkirk Leisure and Culture YouTube channel in our HipFest at Home playlist, where you can rewatch at your leisure, tell your friends. And I hope you will join us again soon for our next HipFest at Home presentation, In the Frame of the Father, about Irish filmmaking priests. We love a good pun here at HipFest. And of course, our Friday night gala screening of The Pride of the Clan, either in person or online. And finally, a quick reminder, our HipFest passes are on sale now, with 5-day and weekend passes available, and numbers are limited. So grab yours as soon as you can to avoid disappointment. See you soon.